Good evening, everyone. Uh, Thank you for joining me tonight for the second part of our series on young adults, their relationship with the church, and how to engage with them, especially with those young adults who have disaffiliated, that is, who have stopped being part of either the Catholic Church, if we're talking specifically, or more generally, Christianity. Tonight, we're going to focus on positive ways of addressing this disengagement. In part one of this series, which is available on our Facebook page and will be posted on our YouTube page probably by the end of this week, we talked about what caused, in the first place, disaffiliation, disengagement of young adults from Christian churches, and what to avoid doing, how to not make that problem worse. Tonight we're going to talk about how to try and address that problem as a concerned Christian, as a concerned Catholic. Put more simply, what can you do if you know someone who is younger and who is no longer Catholic or Christian? I'd like to start off with a brief analogy about the game of chess. Hopefully all of you are somewhat familiar with it. It's a fairly old game, actually. It traces well before the medieval period, even though that's what we associate it with, knights and castles and such. But the original game was probably from Persia and probably existed hundreds, if not over 1,000 years before the version that we know of today. However, even though the names and probably the actual pieces have changed over time, so the original Persian version probably had elephants instead of knights, for example, something remained fairly consistent: the rules of chess. It doesn't matter how old of a version of the game we're looking at. Doesn't matter if we're looking at a version before the game was even called chess. Generally speaking, the pieces move the same ways. The pawns advance one space or two spaces if it's their first move. Knights move in L shapes. Queens move unlimited spaces on diagonals or back and forth. And the objective of the game is to capture the king. This is simply to say that with chess, no matter the historical context, no matter who's playing, you could be teaching your son or daughter to play for the first time. You could be a grandmaster like Magnus Carlsen playing in a tournament. You could be a high schooler like I was playing at lunch with my friends. That doesn't matter either. The rules of chess don't change. And I bring this up because oftentimes we can make a mistake when we approach dealing with religious or other contentious questions, other contentious issues. We can treat them as needing to be dealt with, needing to be engaged with in separate ways from how we would normally engage with issues. And that's a mistake I want to suggest. Think of a successful interaction you've had with someone who is younger than you, significantly younger than you. A child maybe, a grandchild. Maybe it's a younger coworker. Maybe it's a niece or a nephew. Maybe it's a friend of your children, of your grandchildren. Whatever the context is, think of an interaction you've had with someone who is younger that went well. What I want you to add to that thought now is this: like with chess, the rules don't change. What makes one interaction successful will make others successful. Just because you're talking about religion doesn't mean you have to change the rules of how you're talking with someone. Basic things that you learned in grade school, that we learned before grade school from our parents, rules about decency, about respect, about taking our turns, about listening well, things that I'm teaching my 2-year-old now. You have to share, you have to make sure you're listening. These very simple rules carry into very complex arenas, like the one we find ourselves in when we are trying to talk about religion with someone who is a-religious. The rules don't change. Things that have helped you engage with younger persons, young adults in the past, will help you talk to them about religion now. So, what are some of these rules? In the last talk, I shared I thought, very powerful statement from a no longer Catholic young person who I interviewed as part of the synodal process here in the Diocese of Buffalo. They said, "Look at me like a human being, don't look at me like a project." They were saying they didn't want to be instrumentalized. That is, they didn't want to be treated merely as someone who only mattered insofar as they were someone to reconvert, insofar as they were a lost cause to be rescued. They want it to be treated as, they want it to be seen as a person with all of the value that persons are laden with with all of the wants, the dreams, the cares, the preferences, everything that makes up a whole, complete person. They want it to be seen in that way, and they wanted the actions directed at them to treat them in that way. They didn't want to be reduced down to just one more statistic about a person under the age of 40 who's left a church. They didn't want to be reduced down to just one more young person that needs to hear the right words about Jesus and they'll come back. They wanted to be treated like a person. And so those are the rules, then, that we need to be following when we consider engaging with younger audiences. The rules of interacting with persons as persons. If you'll forgive a brief digression into the world of philosophy that I frequent, one of the, call him proto-personalist philosophers, that is, philosophers who spoke about ethics from the perspective of ethics primarily being about treating persons in the right way. One of the proto-personalists, or first personalists, people who started this movement, was the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. And Kant broke down personalism, this ethical prioritization of the person, into largely two things. Persons are valuable, are important, because they are rational and because they are free. That is, Kant saw us as different from other things in the world because we could think as human persons and because we could make free choices as human persons. And so Kant argued then that the right way of treating people was dependent on us respecting those twin unique aspects of persons: rationality and freedom. So the rules then for treating someone like a person rather than a project, we can connect to Kant's formation of, or anthropological conceptualization of, the human person. In other words, put more simply, how is it that we treat someone respectfully by recognizing their rationality and their freedom? When talking about respecting rationality, so the first aspect that Kant focuses on, we can think of something as simple as listening to the reasons someone has for what they believe. Religion is ultimately about individual or personal belief. Those of you who are religious are going to hold certain beliefs that areligious young adults do not hold. Again, to step away from the jargon, you think it is true that there is a God, or you think it is true that the Eucharist is the body and blood of Jesus, or you think it is true that living according to a particular moral code is going to help you get into heaven, or help those you care about get into heaven. I could bring up other examples, but the point here is you believe these things to be true. The areligious young adult does not believe them to be true. And so there's a difference here in belief. Part of respecting rationality is going to involve understanding where a belief comes from. So that's where we can bring up listening to the reasons the young adults offer. Why is it that an areligious young adult doesn't have the belief that you do? Ask them. Ask them, why don't you believe that God exists, that Jesus is God's Son? Why don't you believe that the Catholic Church is the best pathway for salvation? Why don't you believe that the church is right in its stances on gay marriage, in its stances on transgender individuals and gender-affirming care? Why is it that you don't believe that the church is right about whatever particular belief you've heard them voice opposition to? By asking them about their belief, you're demonstrating to them, I actually care what you think I don't just care about looking up the right Bible verse or the right short quotation to refute you. I'm not just doing it so I can prove you wrong and move on to the next thing to prove you wrong on. I'm actually taking the time to find out a little bit about you and to hear what you are telling me, to listen to the story you are describing for me about what made you stop being religious. Respecting our rationality as young adults who are disaffiliated or disaffiliating also involves learning about our perspectives and our sources. This is an extension of understanding our reasons for our beliefs. When a young adult mentions an author you've never heard of, or more likely an influencer you've never heard of on a social media platform you may have never heard of, look up the video they're talking about. Read part of the book from the person that they're referencing. Invest in their beliefs in the same way you want them to invest in yours. Create a back and forth where both of you are now working towards a shared goal. Rather than just imposing a goal on them, I'm going to make you Christian again, create this iterative process where both of you are trying to figure out what's true. They say, I'm not sure about this. You say, well, I'm not sure about this either. I read these people to help me inform myself, and I know you're listening to these people. How about you send me a podcast episode? And then maybe I'll show you a short book title. Or how about you send me one of those videos, or even a channel that you're watching videos on, and I'll look through it. By creating this mutual process then, you're again demonstrating you care about more than just proving yourself right. You care about more than just imposing your beliefs. You're inviting them into this shared pursuit of what's real in the world. You're inviting them to help you understand why they think what they think, and you're showing you actually care about what's driving that for them. Again, it's not just about you ultimately being right, you ultimately getting them back into a church again. It's about you saying, yes, I want to understand what drove you out of the church in the first place. I want to understand why you ended up where you are, and I want to understand what is continuing to form you where you are at right now. Lastly, respecting rationality involves treating us as mature individuals, which can be difficult when young adults don't always act maturely. However, you're going to have to look at us as no longer being just your precious little children or your precious little grandchildren. If you want to have this kind of engagement I've been describing, I'm going to call this little brother syndrome. My brother is 9 years older than me. And my brother struggles with the fact that I also now have a doctorate, that I'm no longer a 5-year-old following him around who agrees with everything I say. Now, he's a very wonderful older brother, but we get in arguments, and he gets very, very frustrated that when he says something, I will fight back. I'll say, well, that's not right because of this, or I'm pretty sure that was just responded to in this study that was just published. Blah, blah, blah. He doesn't like that when I do that. So we have to avoid, I'm going to call it this little brother syndrome, where we don't recognize the growth that happens in people that are always in our eyes going to be less mature than us, younger than us. Yes, it's true. Chronologically speaking, and in a lot of other ways, your children, your grandchildren, people who are younger than you will always remain younger than you. But that doesn't mean they can't grow out of some of the parts of that being younger. That doesn't mean they can't mature. And recognizing that maturity and treating them as being owed the respect of someone like an equal, like an adult equal, that again is going to signal to them, is going to demonstrate to them I'm not just brushing off what you have to say. I'm not just patronizing you. All of this is involved in setting the stage, so to speak, in building an environment where the young adult you want to engage with will actually trust you enough to engage with you, will actually feel like they are being welcomed to speak with you, will actually feel like they're in an open and safe enough space where they can share what they think honestly, without fear of being shouted down or just being dismissed as one more silly child. So that's the first part of setting the rules for positive interactions, for positive engagements. We respect rationality. The second part of setting up our rules, it's respecting freedom, which, at least from what I've heard from my own parents, is one of the most difficult parts of dealing with younger people, especially those that you have a vested interest in the success of. This is something that my dad has been open with his children about. It's very difficult to watch your children fail, especially when you knew they were going to screw something up. Unfortunately, part of, again, setting up this environment that is going to allow any kind of dialogue with younger persons is to give them space to make decisions that you don't like and even that you might know will not help them or even hurt them. That is part of allowing for us to act freely. That's part of not treating us just as an immature child anymore. It's part of giving us the latitude as adults to do something for ourselves and then to realize later on that that something is going to affect our lives in ways we didn't anticipate and in ways that are not good. So then, what does respecting freedom look like? Well, first, it means not ostracizing or shaming us when we don't follow what you expect us to do or when we break from the rules that you think we should be following. This is something that is as simple as maintaining a relationship with a child, with a friend, with a coworker, when that child or friend or coworker or whomever starts breaking out of the boundaries that you think define a flourishing life, a moral life, a good life. Just cutting them off, well, first of all, that precludes any possibility of dialogue. But second of all, that shows them you don't actually care about them. You care about some kind of character value. You care about some kind of judgment of right or wrong. You care about something extrinsic to them as persons. You don't care about them as individuals. So if we're trying to follow the rules that allow for positive engagements, we're going to have to make sure that the space that we're operating in is one that allows for mistakes or failures in our eyes. Because if we're going to have these stringent requirements of you must act in this way and this way and this way and follow this rule and this rule and this rule and live up to this expectation and this expectation and this expectation just for me to talk to you, or just for me to give you affection, or just for me to act in the most basic ways that show some kind of care, some kind of love, well, that's not the best way to maintain a relationship with someone, and it's certainly not a good way to build up any kind of trust or closeness. Relatedly, when we talk about respecting freedom, we need to empathize with why disaffiliated Christians stop acting like Christians. This is to say, we need to understand, again, understanding, we need to empathize, we need to reflect on what makes young adults break these rules that seem to us so important, that seem to us so vital, that seem to us so life-defining. I can summarize why young adults like myself don't act in these ways that seem to many older generations as just obvious. If we leave Christianity, we have no reason to act according to Christian rules. It sounds simple, but it's something very, very hard to appreciate from within the mindset, the paradigm of a Christian. Within the Christian paradigm, you understand God expects this of us. God made us to live in these particular ways. God asks us to follow these laws because he sees them in his wisdom as being better for us. Or God asks us to follow these laws because we have this covenantal relationship with him. There are all these biblical ways, there are all these traditional ways of explaining why it is that God says, do this, don't do this, do this, don't do this. But if you're not starting with those basic premises, there is a God. God has told us in his Bible how to act. The Bible is true. God has also told us how to act through his church, and the church should be viewed as a reliable messenger for God. Absent those premises, why would you believe that you have to act according to what God told someone? In other words, if you don't think God gave Moses the 10 Commandments, why would you follow the 10 Commandments? If you don't think that God told a particular prophet, share with my people this, why would you listen to that prophet? So what we have to find then is common ground. Because those who have stopped being Christian, those who have stopped being Catholic, are not going to necessarily hold on to the cultural remnants, the cultural artifacts of Catholicism, of Christianity. Those who have disaffiliated are, in fact, probably not going to cling to many of those foundational pieces of Christianity, of Catholicism, that you need to make arguments about why this part of Christianity works or why this part of Catholicism is true. So you have to understand, call it, what is shared and what stops being shared once someone disaffiliates. Oftentimes, people who learn multiple languages will tell you that some languages are easier to pick up when you know one than others. The easy example is a Romance language, right? A Latin-based language. I'm not fluent in Spanish, but I know a decent amount of Spanish. And I've actually been able to reverse engineer that into reading some Latin. Why? Because of cognates, words that are really similar. Similarly, if you know Spanish, you can pick up Italian because the words are really similar. Similarly, if you know Italian, you can learn French. Why? And so on and so forth. There are shared pieces of these languages. But if you know Italian, can you easily learn Russian? If you know Russian, can you learn Japanese, not the phonetic language, but the written language, the orthographic language? No, because there's less that's shared among those languages. So we have to keep that in mind as part of our respecting of freedom. We need to know what is shared and what has stopped being shared so we can know where to actually start with our engagement of these young adults. The last thing, respecting change, as I said earlier, respecting freedom, as I said earlier, involves changes in behavior that we are not always going to like. There's a biblical story, though, that I think should be helpful in terms of modeling the response of those of you who have watched younger, especially relatives, stop being Christian. It's the story of the prodigal son. Sometimes The response that is demanded is running out to meet the kid who did incredibly stupid things, hugging them and welcoming them home in love, saying, "My son who was dead is now alive. Let us celebrate." Now, yes, in some circumstances, of course, that's not going to be the right thing to do. That's not always going to be the solution, but more often than not, I would hazard a guess, demonstrating mercy, demonstrating compassion, demonstrating unconditional love is going to help in these engagements. Again, if we value persons, not as projects, not as what they could become, that's going to tell us that we should be starting with the idea of unconditional love. We should be starting with the want to value the other person. We can build in judgment, we can build in recompensation. All of these things can come later. But the start, running out to the Son and embracing him. Last time, in part one, I laid out a very extensive list of things not to do. I figured for part two, it would be helpful to revisit that list somewhat as we talked about concrete actions. So, in talking about the rules of engaging with those who are no longer Catholic, who are no longer Christian, we've been talking in generalities, abstractly. I now want to talk about concrete things to do. And to start off with, we're going to talk about things I said last time not to do and what the positive alternative is to those actions. So, last time I said not everything has to be about evangelization. That is, not every conversation has to be about Jesus. You can talk about baseball sometimes. I think it's opening day today. So, yeah, it's okay to talk about baseball with your kids sometimes. Or don't, because baseball's boring. I don't know, maybe you have kids that like baseball. So, the positive thing you can do, talk to your kid. You don't always have to check up on them. Well, did you go to Mass this week? Well, are you still living with your boyfriend? Well, what? Maybe sometimes your kid just wants to talk to mom and dad. Maybe sometimes your coworker just wants to tell you about the Taylor Swift concert that they went to. Maybe sometimes your great nephew, he just wants to talk about baseball. And that's okay. Because again, when we're working with an understanding of the complete person as being what we care about, what we value, persons have interests. Other than just, is religion in some form true? Does God exist? Is this the right way to live my life? If that's all you ever talk about, your audience is not going to be captive for long. They're going to go interact with someone who acts like a normal person, which is a huge part, ultimately, of being able to engage with people. You have to not act like a robot, a chat GPT in the flesh, so to speak, that only gives responses related to the Bible. No, sometimes you just have to be a normal person having a normal conversation. And that can lead to deeper conversations. But again, we're starting off trying to build trust. We're starting off trying to repair relationships. We're starting off trying to show that we're the kind of person who isn't just going to chuck a Bible at you when we feel you need a Bible chucked at your face. Speaking of which, don't chuck Bibles at people's faces. This is bad faith evangelization. We're not just trying to, we shouldn't just be trying to find every little way to force those atheists to realize they're bad and wretched and stupid and tricksy and all those things. No. If you're looking at your child, your grandchild in that way, you have a very warped sense of who they are, most likely. There are very, very few people in the world that fit the unfortunate Christian stereotype of an atheist. Most people are just people out there living their lives. So, no, you don't need to be sneaking books into their car that have Jesus in the title, like we talked about last time. You don't need to be constantly picking fights with them. Well, you said this last time about whatever, the prophets in the Old Testament, and I read this book from this priest, and he said something different, and how are you going to argue with the priest? We don't need to be asking gotcha questions. So I referenced the evangelist Greg Kokel in my last talk, who wrote an entire book literally about how to trip up someone who doesn't believe in God with semantics, with word games. You don't need to be trying to trap them in imprecise language and uncareful wording. That's not how normal people converse. And you don't need to have a catechism hidden in your back pocket for when they're unprepared, to pull it out and swing it across their face. Because if you do that, what do you lose? Trust. If you do that, what are you showing them? That it's not about you loving them, that ultimately it's about some other goal you have. So don't engage in this kind of evangelization. Instead, do this. Listen to them. So instead of immediately thinking in your mind when they say something, I don't think there's a God. Well, I read one time that this person said we can prove God through the existence of fine-tuning in the universe because the earth exists in the habitable zone of a star this way. Don't immediately formulate a response. Maybe the conversation is not about what you have to say. Maybe you can just sit there and not say anything and hear what the person is telling you. Listen. Second, learn. Some of this may seem repetitive, but I want to emphasize these points because of how important they are. If your child, coworker, friend, whomever, if a young adult you're speaking with is referencing someone you don't understand, you've never heard of, go find out about that person. Now, to clear up a misconception, not everyone who disaffiliates is going to have read Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens or any of the other new atheists. In fact, the popularity of the new atheist has dropped precipitously in the past several years. However, if someone does reference Dawkins or Hitchens or Harris or Dennett, maybe go pick up one of their books. Maybe instead of just saying, oh, those evil, mean atheists, go read one of their books. Or more likely, go watch the debate on YouTube that the person is referencing. Or go listen to the podcast where someone else they know referenced that particular person. Engage with the media that they're engaging with. If they give you an argument you've never heard before about why God can't be good, or about why they don't think the Catholic Church is the right church to belong to, or about why they think that it's okay just for them to have a relationship with God without being involved in a wider religious community. Don't immediately try and bumble your way into an argument that you might not actually believe yourself. Say, I'd never thought of that before. That's something I could learn more about, or that's something we could learn more about together. There's no danger in you working with this person to try and better figure out how the world is and try to better find the God that you believe in the world. And lastly, love. We've been over this before, but it bears repeating. The purpose of evangelization should ultimately be that you think God loves all of these young persons who aren't part of the church. And you think that their being a part of the church will help them better feel that love of God. That should be the only reason why you are evangelizing. to share the love of God with others. So, if they aren't ready for the gospel message as such yet, you can still share God's love in other ways. That's the starting point then. Sharing God's love. If they don't want to hear John 3:16, the football verse, then don't recite it to them. Instead, when they get sick, drop off a pot of chicken soup. Instead, when they go through a nasty breakup, send them a text message and say, hey, if you want to come home this weekend, I can come pick you up. Or if whatever it is that happens, you don't have to respond with, see, if you believed in Jesus, this wouldn't have happened. Or in times like this, I turn to prayer and find it's very helpful. Just say, I am a person in your life that cares about you. What do you need for me to help you? And I'll give you that. We talk about how God provides for us what we need. That God knows what we would ask of him before he asks. Well, we as individuals may lack that omniscience, that foreknowledge. We can still show the same love of God by giving to people what it is they really need, rather than giving to them what we want to give them or what we think they need. So that's love. Related to this, related to the reason for evangelizing, maybe not lots of, but many persons who approach this question of disaffiliation do it from the perspective of, I would say, true love for the individuals who have left a church. That is, they worry about what's going to happen to them when they die. They worry about salvation. They worry about, if you don't belong to this church, if you don't profess belief in God, if you don't profess belief in Jesus, are you going to go to hell? Are you going to get into heaven? This motivation is not in itself bad. It's actually to be expected. Given the beliefs of many Christians, they're going to think that being a Christian is what gets you saved. And so they're going to want people they care about to be Christians so they can be saved. Here's the problem. As we talked about earlier, people who stop being Christian do not share all the same beliefs that they would have shared with you when they were Christian. People who stop being Christian aren't going to be so concerned about heaven and hell anymore, if at all. So then, what should your response be if you still carry this worry about saving a child, a grandchild, a friend, a neighbor, a coworker? Your response should be to go back to why it is you care about their salvation in the first place. Why do you feel this need to save them? Well, that's love of them, right? You want what's best for them. And as those of you who are parents know, getting to what is best for a child especially can sometimes take a really long time and be a very winding road. So if what you want is eventually to help them be saved, if that's what you think is what's best for them, well, then you have to be pragmatic about this and realize you're probably not going to get there directly. And so then just jumping directly into you're going to hell if you don't come to church with me is probably not a great way of showing I love you and so I don't want you to not be saved. Go back to the why, the motivation. You love these people, and so you want them to get the good thing you believe in because of your Christian faith. Okay, so let's start with that love. We talked about this a little bit earlier when I brought up the parable of the prodigal son. While there is certainly some amount of correction in many of the relationships that older adults have with younger adults, Incessant critiquing from religious adults is something that bothers many young adults, especially when those young adults, again, don't share the principles that are motivating the critiques given by their elders. So here again, we have to talk about pragmatic approaches. What can we do when the young adult we care about is doing something that we think is stupid, unhelpful, hurtful, but we don't just want to constantly say, Jesus is going to get mad at you if you do that, to which they respond, well, I don't believe in your Jesus, so I don't care. Okay, how do we avoid this problem? Open-mindedness helps. Questions work instead of critiques. If you do X, what do you think is going to happen? What happened last time you did this? Why do you think this is going to help you get to what you want? Why do you think this is going to make you happy? This is going to make your career advance. This is going to make you and your partner have a stronger relationship. Explore with them. This is another thing that my dad has shared that is difficult for him, especially in his relationship with me. I've been told by my father and several other people that I am very, very, very much like he was at my age. And so my dad, no longer being my age, will tell me, when I was your age, I thought exactly like you do. I don't think that way anymore because I have all this additional experience now. But I don't have that experience, which I realize is frustrating for him because he's trying to help me avoid things that were problems for him in his life. But he can't give me that experience. He can't take my perspective and add the 30-some odd years that he has ahead of me to my perspective. So rather than trying to draw the conclusion for me, saying, don't do this, Josh, it's not going to work, it would work better to say, well, why do you think this is going to work? Interrogate the reasoning behind the young adults wanting for something that you don't think they should want, rather than just telling them, don't want this. As much as we may have matured, we are in some ways still toddlers. If you tell us, don't do this, we're going to do it. So, pragmatically, that's not the right approach to take. Consistency also matters. We talked about this earlier with respect to how it is we should not approach people doing things we don't approve of, people doing things we think are wrong. You have to demonstrate that there are some responses of yours to us that aren't going to change. So this is normally what we phrase as unconditional love. I may be disappointed in you right now. I may have wished you have done something differently, but also I'm not going to stop caring for you. I'm not going to stop helping you. So this is the parent who, when their high schooler goes to a party that the parent said, are you sure you should be going to? Shows up at 10:30 when the kid calls and was like, yeah, I lied to you. My friend's mom actually isn't here and I'm not comfortable being here. The parent shows up and picks the kid up to help them. They made a wrong decision. The parent was suspicious of the decision, but still is going to drive there late at night to get the kid. So consistency in response matters. There are some responses that cannot and should not change regardless of how badly we screw up in your eyes. And many of those responses have to do with how you value us. In other words, even when we do disappoint you, even when we do fall short of your expectations for us, even when we do act in ways that you think are wrong or morally reprehensible, we still need to know that you're not going to abandon us, that you're not going to stop caring about us, that you're not going to view us as lesser persons or as no longer having that same relationship we had with you before, even though we made mistakes. Don't moralize everything. It's very easy to slip into a black and white worldview, a stark worldview of good and evil. Now, I don't want to overgeneralize, because I know one of the themes of my talks have been not to overgeneralize, but it seems like this happens more often as we age, where it becomes easier to take our patterns of thinking and say pretty much everything that happens fits into these patterns. And pretty much everyone that's out there fits into one of these two broad groups, these two camps. And over time, we simplify those groups. We simplify our way of explaining the events that happen in the world. We need to be careful not to do that, especially when dealing with young adults contemporarily, because our world is incredibly complicated. Whether it's because of the effects of social media and how that's changed how we interact with each other, whether it's because of the economic conditions that we're dealing with, so the effects of, say, student loans, the incredible effects of inflation on, say, house prices, whether it's the difficulty in finding work once we have a college degree, or even once we have an advanced degree, whether it's the delays in what have usually been viewed as like markers of maturation, so delays in when we're getting married, when we have our first child, when we move out of our parents' house, whether it's the fact that you have a world that is so much more fractured than a world that many of you would have lived your young adulthoods in. Say, maybe a world where you had the good guys who weren't communists and the bad guys who were communists. A world in which you had the good guys who were fighting for freedom and the bad guys who were fighting for oppression. The world that we see now is not like that. And so the easy moralizing overgeneralizations, this is good, this is bad, why can't you see that? That again is going to sabotage the relationship you could be building with the person you're speaking to, but it's also going to lead them to dismiss those things that you have to say that are relevant to morality and religion because they see you as missing something, well, important, the nuance of their lives. If you can't appreciate that, they have no reason to listen to you when you comment on their lives because they just are going to think that you don't understand them. Which leads into another point. Kids these days are more complicated than they seem. First of all, kids these days are not millennials anymore. I am a millennial. I am one of the youngest millennials. Based on how the Pew Research Center defines millennials, I have a child. My college students are Gen Z, the generation after millennials, except some of them are already out of college. There's a generation alpha now, high schoolers moving into college. So to be clear who we're talking about, it's not those lazy millennials eating their avocado toast and drinking their $12 coffees, just to throw that out there. I bring this up not just because I'm trying to summon the okay boomer meme that some of you may have been sent by your children, but rather because I want to point out that these stereotypes that we might have about younger generations or that younger generations might have about you guys, these stereotypes are incredibly unhelpful when it comes to building relationships. If I think that every old person is racist, that is very much going to taint my ability to engage with you and to understand how you see the world, how you view incredibly important issues in our society today. I'm going to dismiss the amazing work that was done by older generations to say bring about civil liberties for black people in the United States. If I just say anyone born before 2000 is obviously a racist, which I wouldn't say because I was born before 2000, but hopefully you get the point. But similarly, if every person who was born before 1980 says, well, everyone who was born after the 80s or after the 90s, they're just lazy, they're just entitled, they're just woke, or whatever the pejorative is that we happen to throw out. Again, we're collapsing an incredibly diverse, an incredibly pluralistic group of persons into a one-word label that has all but lost its meaning. If we're willing to say millions upon millions of people are just this one thing, and we know what that thing is from a couple of sound bites that we heard from our favorite news network, a couple of sound bites we heard from our favorite podcast, or even just because everyone on Facebook that we're friends with uses that word, well, we have completely thrown away the task, abandoned the task of understanding. We've abandoned the task of empathy. We've abandoned the task of seeing people as individual persons in their completeness, in their uniqueness. And if we've abandoned that work, well, we have very little hope of engaging with anyone. We're just going to be shadowboxing, so to speak, stereotypes. I don't know if any of you remember, there was a CNN program a long time ago that actually Tucker Carlson started off on. I don't remember the name of it, but it was just a conservative and a liberal who'd basically fight for like an hour. I know about this program because Jon Stewart went on it and made fun of Tucker Carlson's bow tie and basically led to the ending of that program because he just pointed out, you guys are talking past each other. You're creating this stereotypical view of liberalism, of conservatism, and mocking this straw man, and neither of you are actually addressing what the other person believes because you don't care what the other person believes because you're content to make fun of this made-up version of what they believe. That's what we need to avoid. So, what does this go back to? Talk to kids these days, listen to kids these days, and engage with the culture that they're a part of. Yes, I dislike the music many of my college students listen to just as much as you do. I grew up with my dad's classic rock albums on vinyl. But I still try to figure out who these various people are who are doing Super Bowl shows now, just so I can understand references, so I can be, somewhat knowledgeable of what my students care about. Because that's part of how I show I care about my students, which goes into then my building relationships with them. Lastly, I wanted to end on an even more positive note. So we're no longer just presenting, don't do this, do this. Now we're just going to talk about, here are good things to do, with no qualifiers. I was reading a book to prepare for this talk. It's called Growing Young. It was written by a collection of Christians who did some quantitative research on how it is that, on how churches can bring in younger persons and how they can allow those younger persons to feel integrated with their church communities. It's a very good book, relevant to this topic for people working within a Christian perspective. But one of the pieces of advice presented in the book was that churches need to have better coffee. What do they mean by that? Well, how many of you drink black coffee in the morning? Or something close to just like, I put coffee in the coffee filter and ran water through the coffee filter and then poured coffee in my mug. Does that sound somewhat familiar to many of you who drink coffee? And then you look at what my students have from Starbucks or from one of their local artisanal roasteries, and you're like, I don't know what half these words are. There's more foam in there than coffee. I don't know why it matters that the Arabica bean was sourced from this particular location. The thing is, though, my students don't like drinking Folgers or Maxwell House. They like drinking lattes, cappuccinos, Americanos, and so on and so forth with various flavors in them and different types of milk. You have to have coconut milk or almond milk because some of them are lactose intolerant. They like that stuff. Churches that just put out Folgers are saying what to people who don't like Folgers? We don't care about what you like. So, churches having better coffee then means churches actually need to pay attention to what younger people want if they want younger people to come in. Let me give you an example from our campus ministry work here at the Newman Center. We will offer to take students out for coffee every so often, just to talk with students one-on-one, to check in with someone who's having a bad week, a bad semester, to introduce ourselves to a new student. This year, we've stopped taking students out for coffee. We've instead started taking them out for bubble tea. That's tea with tapioca balls, for those of you who don't know what that is. Why did we start taking them out for bubble tea? Because they like bubble tea more than they like going out for coffee at a Tim Hortons or even at a Starbucks. We switched what we were doing just because it better matched our students' preferences. Asking what young adults value and then providing that, that's not just a question and a response that churches need to have. That's something that applies to us as well. When I am teaching, so when I'm acting as a professor, I need to actually try and provide relevant, not just examples in my classes, but applications of what I'm teaching my philosophy students for them to care about what I'm teaching them. As a campus minister, I shouldn't be talking just about my experiences in college because I went to college not before my students were born, despite what some of them might tell you, but still long enough ago that what I cared about back then might not be what they care about now. We have to figure out what the young adults value so that we can provide them something that is worthwhile to them, something that they want to receive from us. In short, we need to give them better coffee. Second, model the compassion of Jesus. When we talk about interactions between even the disaffiliated and churches, there is one thing above all others that bring together still Christian persons, so affiliated, religiously affiliated persons, and disaffiliated persons: service work. There is a strong want for service for the most vulnerable and the most needy in our communities from young adults. They care about addressing injustice in the world. They care about providing for social justice. They care about serving those who need it. That's why you have the greater awareness of, say, systemic racism. It's why you have the greater awareness of the U.S.'s support for regimes that are operating illegal wars or wars that break the rules of war as defined by the international community, like, say, what Saudi Arabia is doing in Yemen, like, say, what Israel is doing in Palestine. These kinds of issues appeal to a very strong sense of justice, a very sharp sense of justice that many, 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 many young adults have. And that doesn't differ between the religious and the irreligious of the young adults. So, by modeling Jesus' compassion for young adults, by involving our churches in the work of Jesus himself, the work Jesus called his apostles to, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, caring for the ill, visiting, comforting the mourning, by doing the very work that Jesus himself did as Christians, which is what Christians should be doing anyways, we are providing points of contact between Christians and between disaffiliated young adults. We are also demonstrating, going back to good coffee, something to our young adults that they value. We're showing we value this thing too. And this goes back to learning languages, right? What is it that we share? Care for the oppressed is something that, quantitatively speaking, matters a lot to the disaffiliated. And so, if churches actually lived out the mission that they were charged with by Jesus, it would be a lot easier for them, if not to bring young adults back to the pews, at least to find a way to speak to young adults in love and to show young adults the love of God. I'd like to end with this last concrete action. And it has to do with how we might converse with young adults. If they ask you a question you don't know the answer to, tell them, I don't know. If they ask you about a part of your faith that is difficult for you, tell them, that's hard for me. If they tell you, I'm not sure I believe this, and you struggle with that belief too, tell them, I have the same doubts. Be honest. Be authentic and genuine. Be consistent with what you actually believe and how you actually act. We talked about being a normal person earlier who can talk about baseball. Here, be a real person. You don't have to project a perfect image just because you're older, just because you're a parent, just because you're a mentor. Let us see your vulnerabilities. Then we'll be more comfortable sharing ours. Let us know that you don't have everything figured out. And then we'll tell you the same about ourselves. Let us know that you're capable of understanding why parts of the Christian faith seem wrong to us, seem harmful to us. And then we'll be more willing to listen to you about that faith. Again, going back to quantitative data gathered about millennials, Gen Zers, and then by extrapolation, Gen Alpha, we care about genuineness, about authenticity a lot. If you look at marketing data, for example, we are far more likely to buy a product that is endorsed by an influencer that we follow. Why? Because we look at them as like an online friend telling us this is a good thing. So we don't care about the Super Bowl ads necessarily. We don't care about whether or not the company is, selling the latest and best of basketball shoes. We do care about if someone that we interact with on a daily basis says, I like this thing. Authenticity matters. So if authenticity matters, you need to be authentic. Let us see the real you, and then in turn, we'll be more willing to show you the real us. In closing, I wanted to share a quote from Pope Francis. This comes from the opening of the Synod and Synodality a few years back. And this was how Francis described the attitude that Catholics needed to have. He said, if the parish is to be a home to everyone in the neighborhood, and not a kind of exclusive club, please, let's keep the doors and windows open. So rather than closing the door behind us when we've left the church, leave it open. Leave the window open. Don't demand that we return. Don't try and drag us over the threshold, but rather allow us to see an inviting church, an inclusive church for us to come back to. Separately, Francis has spoken of the church as a field hospital, a place not for the perfect, but for the injured to find healing. So, by respecting us, by being honest with us, and by loving us, you're letting us see this as a refuge from a complicated, dangerous, frightening world. You're letting us see this as a place where we can heal from the hurts that we've suffered. And by offering that, you're not just offering what Jesus asked all Christians to do in his name, you're also showing us a place that we one day might want to come back to. Thank you. As a reminder, if you have a question, Jewel is going to be coming around with a microphone, so for anyone who's live streaming to hear you, you have to talk into the microphone. So if you have a question, just raise your hand and Jewel will bring you the speaking stick. Anybody?
Most inviting church that I have ever.
Thank you.
And it's all surrounding young people that you're talking about. Sorry, I didn't wait.
Question?
To talk about what was going to happen. And my
Mm-hmm. I think I think you're very right that any discussion of the future of the church needs to be much more focused on its actual future. Um, Even talking about young adults from the perspective of people my age, most people who leave the church, as I mentioned in my last talk, do so in high school. The median age for someone to leave the church, I believe, is around 14 or 15 years old. So it's before college. And I've been out of college for a while now. So the discussion shouldn't be focused on me or even on my college students. It should be focused on the children of millennials who, again, quantitatively speaking, are far less likely to be churched. That is, they're starting off without any religion because mom and dad don't have any religion. And this is only growing generation to generation to generation. And so it's things, how do I want to say this? If you're starting from the perspective of it matters to bring people into the church, it's things like, I don't know, not subsidizing Catholic education anymore. That should be especially worrisome. It's things like programs in churches focusing more so on the people who are in the pews so as not to lose them, rather than risking aiming at people who aren't in the pews to bring in the next generation that are handicapping the church. So I'm not going to deny that we put a large amount of effort here at the Newman Center into our students. And we are also started devoting more of the precious hours we have from some part-time employees and some volunteers to trying to build a young adult presence here, especially a young family presence at the Newman Center. And yes, there's an opportunity cost with that. We could be doing more for our established community. And if you want me to talk about dollars and cents, that opportunity cost affects us financially. Younger families don't give us money, pretty much. Our established community does, but that can't be what drives our decision for how we're doing ministry, or at least it shouldn't be. One, that's a terrible way to run a church, focusing on your bottom line over the spiritual goods that you can give to people, but two, that's very, very nearsighted in a very dangerous way. Because in 20 years, how many of the 60 and 70 and 80-year-olds who go to any churches in the U.S. are still going to be there? And if you haven't brought in anyone else, how many of those churches are going to stay? So yeah, there has to be some kind of prioritization, not just of young adults, but of their children, of the generations that are following them up. And there has to be, I think, a much more prioritized focus, a much more urgent focus on what good ministry to those upcoming generations looks like. There are definitely people doing good work in this, but I don't know, especially here in Buffalo, when you go into churches and you still see 90% of people there with no hair or very, very gray hair, that has to tell you something about how much young adult presence is being prioritized. In the North American, this is the last thing I'll say on this, but in the North American report for the Synod, I think there was one paragraph on the role of young adults in the church's future. One paragraph. Right next to several paragraphs about how it was important to continue offering Latin masses and how people were very upset about that. They got quotations. None of my young adults did. That should tell us something, I think, about where priorities are and about, well, the dangers for the church about where present priorities are. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know?
So there's a lot of things I could say about that. What I will say is this. The kind of focus that needs to be had, not just here in Buffalo, but across the United States and also across from the world, I'm not sure that focus is going to originate from priests. In fact, I don't think it's going to originate from priests. Partially that's understandable. Priests don't have families. So it's difficult for them to understand the perspective that parents are going to have. It's difficult for them to make decisions based on things that are not a part of their life. But also I think, and this is not just based on me speculating, this is based on knowing some people who've went to seminary and knowing about their experiences, that the preparations in seminary are not designed to bring out priests who are good managers. They're not designed to bring out priests who are able to shift the models that we're using within our worship communities. That is, priests are being trained by people who've done stuff this way for a very, very long time. They're being trained by older priests, or they're being trained by older nuns, or they're being trained by lay persons who've been in a seminary for decades. It's not like you're bringing in these researchers who wrote this book to teach at the seminaries. It's not like you're bringing in people from Georgetown's Cara Institute. It's not like you're inviting the Pew researchers in to say, here are the best ways to do that. It's not like when a priest comes to a parish, he sits down with, I don't know, his campus minister, to use an egotistical example, and says, hey, you're the one who's been doing campus ministry for a while, or you're the one who's under 40 years old. What do you think should be going on here? Actually, I shouldn't say that in all cases. I'd like to throw out that I think Father Dan's done a really good job of coming in here and actually supporting us as campus ministers and saying, hey, you're the experts. What works, what doesn't? Where do you need me? Tell me where to go, because you know where I should go. I don't know that. But a lot of young priests aren't like that. They come in and say, this is what I was taught in seminary, and this is what you better be doing, and so why aren't you doing it? So I think, as with many things in the church, the change that is needed is going to have to come from outside of the sacristy, so to speak. It's going to have to come from people not wearing collars. Some of that change can come from deacons. So there are your professionals, your middle-aged men who actually have the experience to run parishes in ways that will not result in them being bankrupt or result in them collapsing as organizations. But some of it also is just going to come from, call it the voices of those in the pews. But that also carries with it a responsibility of those in the pews voicing the things that they have to voice. I know with my grandparents and even with my parents. So in the pre-Vatican II church, there was a sense of otherworldliness that priests carried, a sense that they were to be respected, not to be challenged, that the priest, when he said something, was simply to be taken at his word. And I think that's a cultural norm that has to be corrected, a cultural norm that has to be changed. Not because all priests are terrible persons, no. Not because no priest can do the job of being a pastor well, no. Because the job of a pastor is impossible. Priests are asked to do way too much. And that's pastor of one parish, let alone 5. Because of how difficult the world is. You can't train an 18-year-old or a 25-year-old or a 45-year-old in 5 or 10 years how to address every single issue a parish priest might have to address. You can't train them to be experts in projecting every single trend, demographic trend in the world. You can't train them in best practices for running a faith formation group. We have someone who has a master's in education, who was a teacher for young children running our faith formation. That's expertise Katie has, that all of our priests here have recognized. They let Katie do her work because she's good at it. I'm not going to claim special expertise in working with college students, but I'm also not 60 years old, which is kind of important to work with college students. So I think some of this, it's a paradigm shift, it's a model shift, where we have to address the ways in which we have always done things and change those up a little bit to make those ways of doing things fit the world that we're actually in now. Mhm. Yeah, I think, like I said earlier, the common thread among older Christians, younger Christians, and younger persons who are disaffiliated or unaffiliated, so just unconnected religiously, it's a desire to fix a very broken world. And I think we can see that, like in the confirmation kids coming up with the service project on their own. They had worked with Eileen's homeless ministry previously and wanted to know how they could help. And Eileen said, there are kids like you who don't have houses and don't have food. And the confirmation kids came up with this food drive. Yep. Mhm. And, yeah. And I think the other thing to point out as well, too, there's a huge difference between coming to mass and sitting in the chairs and listening to a homily, and then actually doing something that involves acting on the things that are in the homily. So Father Roy's preaching, all of you know, it's action oriented. Yeah, that involvement. That involvement matters far more, I would say, than what names on the front of the church you enter, or if you enter the front of that church. Because if you're going in and you never do anything about it, what's the point of going in on Sunday? Mm-hmm. I think that is very much, that's true for us here in Buffalo, and that's going to be true across the United States, and more that's going to be true across the developed world, where you see both the amount of people entering into religious life decreasing and the amount of people who identify as Catholics, as Christians, decreasing. Those who are Christian they have to take ownership of that title, of that name, and act according to it. So I'm going to have Jewel end the live stream now. We can continue our conversation, though. But thank you very, very much for all of your comments, for all of your questions, and for coming tonight.